believing in your own hype.
You just have to fight and get back and believe in yourself. The scars are still there, but I'm happy with those scars now. I've had a period in my life where I believed in my own myth, where I really thought that anything I touched would turn into gold.
If you met the guest of our episode today at a dinner party, you would see a calm, charming, eloquent man, somebody who exudes the confidence that comes from having been around for a while and knowing how to navigate the choppy waters of life. You could never imagine that the same man built a business that lost 200 million euros, had to let go of 400 people, and was close to being public enemy number one in the Netherlands. Ruud Hendriks takes us through his impressive journey from DJ to reporter to media magnate to founder of Startup Bootcamp, one of the most successful startup accelerators in the world. We learn how he experienced failure on a gigantic scale, how it felt to be hated by the Dutch public, and how he knew he had hit rock bottom. Ruud talks about the thin line between the self-belief required to build a successful global business and believing your own hype that led to the failure of the sports channel he was about to launch. How do you rebuild your confidence when you don't even have the strength to leave the house and your marriage is falling apart? One of Ruud's mantras is mind over matter, the belief that you will pull yourself out of it, but this time whilst looking after yourself and with the help of psychotherapy, a supportive life partner, and good friends. Please meet Ruud.
This is Naked by the Future Farm, where entrepreneurship is stripped to its vulnerable core. Brought to you by Vladimir Skobrestinska and Nectarios Lolios.
And remember, subscribe, follow, and rate Naked to help share it with the world. So welcome, Ruud Hendriks. Thank you so much for joining us. When we were talking about our conversations today, because we tried to get a very diverse perspective on entrepreneurship, I was super grateful that you could join us. There is something about our conversation where it's like, where do we start with you? Because you had so many different hats on the entrepreneurial side, on the corporate side, on a sort of hybrid side. And it was just wonderful to kind of, we're just looking forward to our conversation because you just had so much life that you can talk about, right? It's different if it's...
That's what you get when you become 61 years of age.
Yeah, but you're only a few years ahead of me, but you've done so many things. And anyway, I'm super excited. I think it would be interesting to start with just sharing a little bit how we know each other. So we met in Startup Bootcamp. You're one of the founders of Startup Bootcamp overall. So when I joined, there was already this machinery that was actually looking to help entrepreneurs. And I came into this quite naively, right? I knew the corporate innovation side of this. I worked with founders, but I never really worked this closely with founders. And the reason we're doing Future Farm and the focus on entrepreneurs is partly driven by us seeing founders time and time struggle and fail. When you started all this way back in 2010, what was the motivation behind Startup Bootcamp? Was there this emotional element as much a part of it as the business support?
Well, to be very honest, I was slightly selfish. I celebrated my 50th birthday in 2009. And at the birthday party, my wife said to me, okay, Ruud, you've been doing a lot in media and radio and TV. What's next? And I said, how come? And she said, well, you know, you've earned enough money to start a new business. You've got a large network. You've made your money in the radio and TV industry. And we all know that with Pandora and with Spotify and Netflix, that industry is not the best business to continue working in. So Patrick, my one of the co-founders of Startup Bootcamp, was standing next to me, and he said, "It's time to do something completely different. And it's time we should work together again. So, what is the best thing business-wise you've ever done? And how would you like to build on that?" I said, "Well, I just love starting companies, and after a few years, I usually get very bored in a company because it then has reached a certain size, etc." So he laughed and he said, well, why don't we start a company to help others start companies? And I thought it was a crazy idea. I said, okay, you go ahead and I'll just hear from you. And 3 weeks later, he gave me a call and he said, listen, I found a company in New York. They're called Techstars. And I'm going to go there next week. And are you going to go with me? So we hopped on a plane. We flew to New York. We were extremely nicely welcomed by the founders of Techstars New York. So the selfish part, the selfish part was that it wasn't my intention to help others, but I have always enjoyed talking about my failures and obviously also about my successes, and teaching other founders about my experiences, so they don't make the same mistakes. And I love very driven, very ambitious young people. By the way, elderly people as well. As long as they have a certain ambition, it's fine for me. It's been 10 years now. It's been a hell of a ride.
When you shared your failures with the younger or older founders, what was the motivation behind this? Do you think that somebody can listen to somebody going, you know what, I actually made a few mistakes and it backfired. Make sure you don't make the same mistake. Do you think that people actually can process that?
I think so. First, because I think the stories themselves are pretty interesting and they are really important lessons. And my biggest failure ever was a sports channel that I suggested starting up, and which actually did start up and that broadcasted for 4 months and then went off the air, and it has cost about 100 million euros, the whole project. And the biggest mistake we made was that we thought that we knew what the TV audience wanted. And we were so convinced about our knowledge and our experience and that we knew the tastes of the audience, that we made a mistake that many, many large companies make. You're over self-confident. You don't think you have to do your validation anymore. And as a result, you fail miserably. So this is a story that I talk about a lot. Also with C-level board members in very large corporations. So I always advise them not to make the mistakes that I make. But, I've made many mistakes and I'm still making mistakes I won't say every day, but on a very regular basis, unfortunately.
As we all do. Ruud, I don't want to deprive our audience of your background before Startup Bootcamp. So I love how the story starts around you being a DJ and then navigating towards broadcasting. You told us before we started recording that actually the DJing allowed you to kind of transcend into a level of energy, which was in some way parallel or similar to some of the energies that you were facing when being a journalist and going into some of the, difficult environments, difficult situations that you were facing, the dramas and tragedy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I come from a relatively poor or maybe modest family background. My parents both didn't study. I was very shy at school. When I had to stand up in front of a classroom and address the class, I was blushing. When I was 13 years of age, Vladimira, I wouldn't have dared to talk to you. But when I turned 13, I realized that I couldn't continue living like that because it was really hindering me. So when we had a few guys in our classroom who had a pop band and they played music and they lacked a singer. And I just thought, if I ever want to overcome my shyness, I just have to go on stage. So I said, hey, listen, I'm a singer. So if you need a singer, I'll sing. And they looked at me and first they didn't believe me. And then I joined the band and I did a few gigs with them. And then, of course, I was extremely nervous at the beginning. But then I started to realize that once you connect with the crowd, that it gives you a certain sense of power as well. And then I realized that I probably wasn't as good as Mick Jagger, so maybe I should do something else.
I was actually thinking about Freddie Mercury's story, because he also had this shyness and complexes, and then went on a stage and rocked it. Yeah.
Yeah. But then I thought, I could probably DJ. So I started DJing in clubs. And from clubbing came radio work. And DJing in a club. I started as a DJ playing soul music. I went on to disco, and I'll never, ever forget the first time I put on Donna Summer's I Feel Love, which for me is the real beginning of house music. And house music is magical. Obviously I'd learned to control the crowd with soul music and disco. But once we started playing house, it really became magic.
I can see why.
In house music, you say to an audience, "Listen, guys, trust me. I'll take you on a trip, and I'll put you safely back on Earth a couple of hours from now." And obviously, MDMA and ecstasy and drugs are an important part of that community feeling that you can create in the world. And as a DJ, I strongly advise you not to use any drugs when you're doing a gig. But you have to understand what the audience is going through when they're on the dance floor. But once after, let's say, half an hour, that dance floor is filled, then you play a few tracks, and then you really can control the crowd. And I can't describe it differently, but it's magic. It gives you a certain sense of power, because, if you want them to throw up their hands in the air, it's just one effect that you can create. And for certain they'll throw up their hands in the air. If you want them to go left, they go left. If you want them to go right, they go right. And that's fantastic. And that same feeling I had at a certain moment when I started doing radio work. I was a radio DJ on board Radio Caroline, a pirate radio ship, beaming into the UK and the Benelux countries with 50,000 watts of power. That's really a very powerful transmitter, amplified by the seawater. So real coverage was probably even larger. And you have to imagine you're sitting on a ship, you're sitting in a studio. There's hardly a possibility to look outside, but there's this big transmitter below decks, and there's a 72 meter tower above your head, beaming your signal to an audience. And although you can't see anybody, you know that there are at least hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people listening to you. And when you play You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet by Bagman Turner Overdrive, it's 4:00 in the afternoon, and you start your drive time program, it is almost like you can control that crowd as well. And that's magic. And later I started doing TV work, first as a reporter, later I started hosting TV programs as well. I co-hosted the 1988 Olympics in Seoul for the Dutch national sports, Dutch public television, the national sports program. And it's, if a TV program is really running smoothly and you look into that camera, it gives you that same feeling of control. I can't describe it differently. And for a guy who was not even able to address a blonde girl at the age of 13, that's magic.
So what does the power and control represent in your life? Because that's coming out quite strongly. And I'm wondering whether you ever thought about, or it happened to you, that it was taken away from you.
No, not really. I've, after I had overcome that hurdle of shyness, and after I'd started doing this, maybe my well, in the first years, I could really say eagerness to stand on the stage or to sit in front of a camera or present a radio program in front of a microphone. In the beginning, I sort of needed that. But after a certain moment, I also realized that, they always say everybody has his own 3 minutes of fame. But, sometimes when people are successful, they start believing in their own myth. And I've had a period in my life where I believed in my own myth, where I really thought that anything I touched would turn into gold. I was co-founder of the first few commercial radio and TV stations in this country. They became huge successes. So I really thought that I couldn't fail. And then obviously I failed miserably. I mean, I failed in such a huge way that I was literally down and out. And then it took me a couple of years to regain my self-confidence. And in the end, we solved all the issues that came up. And then when I became, well, I'd say wealthy, about 8-9 months later, my wife told me that she wanted a divorce. And I was married. I had 3 kids, and once again I thought, made a lot of money, can do whatever I want. And once again I was really down and out. And at that moment it's terrible, but later you realize how important those moments are, because I don't think I was a very nice guy when I was successful, to be honest. I could probably act nice. I don't think I was really nice or empathetic. And as a result, I think I became a much better human being, although it's hard to say from yourself. But I learned a lot. And as I mentioned, I still learn a lot. The thing is, with driven people, and I'm pretty driven myself, if they start doubting themselves too much, they can't perform. If you're a top athlete and you have to run the 100 meters, let's say below 10 seconds, and you start doubting yourself at 40 meters, if you can actually make it to 100, then you're not going to make it. I strongly believe in mind over body. If you really have to go to the toilet and it's 100 meters away, then you'll probably make it. If at the last moment they add an extra 10 meters, you're probably going to wet yourself. But if you knew in advance that it would be 110 meters, you'd probably made it. So that's mind over body. So actually, I'm pretty happy that I failed miserably. Although that's cost me a lot.
I think it's a good point to just kind of dig a little bit deeper into what actually it means because you just mentioned this in one line, I failed miserably, and then you talk about it took you 2 years to come out of it, right? So what exactly happened, and how grand was the scale of that failure?
Well, as I mentioned, I had launched the first 2 commercial TV stations in the Netherlands. The first 2 commercial radio stations, they became huge hits. And then I became CEO of CNBC in London, and changed NBC Super Channel into CNBC. That was successful as well. And then I was asked to join the executive board of Endemol Entertainment, which at that moment was Europe's largest independent TV production company. So I suggested buying the rights for the Dutch football competition, or the soccer competition, as they say in the US. And to make a long story short, we bought those rights for about 600 million euros. And then we added another 100 million to create a TV station with those rights. In order to find the 700 million that we needed for the sports channel, John de Mol, one of the founders of Endemol and the creator of The Voice and the creator of Big Brother, and me phoned a few old acquaintances. And actually, we got the 700 million within 36 hours, which is unbelievable. You approach someone.
Wow.
So it took me 2 years to find 30 million euros to launch the first TV stations, which became a huge success. And then it took me 36 hours to find the 700 million that we needed for the sports channel, which became the biggest failure in my life. To make a long story short, we acted in great secrecy. So I took the management of the Dutch Football Association to New York, to NBC, to the NFL, to the NBA, and I showed them how NBC had exploited those sports rights in the US, and I urged them to do the same thing in the Netherlands. So the public broadcasters were really hit in the back when we announced, okay, we bought the rights and we're going to launch a separate sports channel just to broadcast football. And immediately after the news broke, radio and TV journalists and newspaper journalists started calling cable operators because they had the impression that they had already acquired 10% of the shares, while we had mentioned that we had only reserved 10% of the shares. So they started calling those cable operators, and the cable operators said, well, we've not heard anything about it, and we're definitely not going to put this station on our cable headends, which obviously it's a power play, but it meant the news broke on a Saturday. On Monday morning, all the Dutch newspapers announced Dutch football won't be seen on TV 3 months from now. Which, I mean, it's not really good for your image because, I mean, football is like a national heritage. But at that moment, and that was the first mistake we made, we looked at football as a regular product, while the emotions coming along with soccer and football are such that if you start treating this as a regular product, you're doomed to fail. So we had bad publicity from day one. And then there was such a huge outrage in the country that the Dutch cabinet, the Dutch ministers, had an emergency session and came together to discuss the unrest in the country, which is, I mean, this is crazy.
Wow.
We're talking about a TV station. So I was literally summoned to The Hague to the Minister of Economic Affairs, who said to me, listen, what are you doing? And can you please tell me what you're doing? And because the outrage is such that I have to respond and I don't know how to respond. So I explained the whole situation. And then there was a lot of pressure from the Dutch government, political pressure on our shareholders, the people who had come up with the money, the 700 million within 36 hours, to at least sub-license part of those football rights to the Dutch public broadcasters. And you have to be aware that football in those days was broadcasted on a Sunday night at 7 o'clock. So we said that time slot is reserved for our big football show. And the Dutch public broadcasters sub-licensed it, and they broadcasted the same football matches, at 10 o'clock in the evening. But the audience was so outraged and angry with us that they just didn't watch us. They waited until 10 o'clock at night to watch the public broadcasters. But I'll never forget the 10th of August 1996 when we were broadcasting our first football match from the Amsterdam Arena, the home ground of Ajax. And there were 52,000 people in the stadium, and I was there as well, in the audience. And the director of the program thought it was nice to just show his CEO on the large video screens in the stadium. So he showed my face in the stadium, and 52,000 people started booing me.
Wow.
And shouting things that I won't repeat in this podcast. And my kids were with me. I was walking outside the stadium. I was attacked literally by football fans. I had to be protected by bodyguards. When I walked out of my very comfortable home, there were journalists waiting. Even at 7 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't pick up the newspaper from the post box anymore. It was just horrible. But I just spoke about those 3 minutes of fame. The great thing is that those experiences, they come up, they're extremely intense, but they also fade away pretty rapidly. So in the end, I was able to take my revenge. The station broadcasted for 4 months. We were losing so much money that we had to close it down. So when the station closed down, I had said, okay, I'll launch it, but then someone else has to manage it. So I had handed it over to another CEO. And when the station closed down, I was having dinner in Tokyo, in Japan, where I was trying to sell some TV programs. And that evening, someone made a picture of me and took a picture of me. And I don't have the picture anymore, but I'll have to try and find it one day, because on that picture, you see a very, very sad small, shy guy who looked like he was, although he was, 36 years of age, he looked like he was 13 and at his high school again. And it was just such a tremendous blow. And Joop said to me, Ruud, did you do everything you could to solve this? And I said, yes, I did. He said, well, you look like a knocked out boxer. So what I want you to do is to take 3 weeks of vacation. The first week, wonder yourself, how could this happen? The second week, just take a break, read a book, do anything, but don't think about it. And the third week, think about how we're going to earn this money back, because I want every euro back. And me, Joop, and John each lost something like 20 million. And the difference between me and them was that they had the money, I didn't. So I had to borrow 10 million from each of them. And I slept with that debt for about 4 years. And, you know, as I mentioned, until that moment, I believed in my own myth. And ever since then, I've realized never to take any experiences you may have had for granted. And to always validate first if what you consider to be a good business idea, to validate it properly and thoroughly, and only then move ahead financially. So these were the days that I'd never heard of lean startup yet. If I would have heard of lean startup in those days, it would have saved us a lot of money and a lot of mistakes.
But you wouldn't be where you are today. I mean, and Ruud, thanks. I mean, what an life experience. What a story.
Yeah. Well, we were lucky. The end of the story is that we sold Endemol 4 or 5 years later for I think it was 5.7 billion euros. And we were a public company at that moment. But I was able to pay my debts back and have a comfortable life after that.
I'm tempted to say thank you for your openness, but at the same time, that's one of the things I noticed when I first met you is that you have, and maybe this comes from your experience in your life, you have this extreme candor that is so disarming. So I remember sitting down at some point, and I was not prepared to have, within 10 minutes of not having seen each other in a while, having a conversation about relationship problems and how you navigate around that. But there is something about the way you just describe what happened, that is just, you're with, so I'm with you on the journey, I'm with you with the pain. But I would still like you to tell us a little bit more about the moment where you realized this is rock bottom. How do you process that, especially when you kind of also have to process that this is you falling from your heights, having believed your own hype?
Well, you know, the rock bottom moment came in Tokyo, you know, sitting in a restaurant having undoubtedly a great sushi and realized you have failed miserably. And I was just, you know, it took my self-confidence away. I didn't dare to walk the streets anymore. I literally needed bodyguards for a number of months. My children said to me, Daddy, what have you done? Because all these people are angry at you. But one of the great things about Joop van den Ende was very important to me in those days. Because first, he didn't blame me for the fact that things go wrong. He just said, hey, did you do everything you could do to solve this and to create a success out of this? And he had seen me doing that. So he said, you know, this is part of your education, you know. Sometimes in business you have to take a certain risk, and it also means that you can fail, and every entrepreneur every now and then fails. But the great thing was also that he said, I want to earn every euro back.
But Ruud, I want to go back, because there is the thing around, you went through an experience which, based on what you shared with us, seems like impacts one's identity, self-identity, potentially can even leave a scar. And then you described that you got the 3 weeks within which one was reflect, the second is actually switch off, and the third one is already think, how do you get the money back, which is not really a 3 weeks vacation. And then you described that you actually came up with an idea. How does that, what happens on that U curve from that experience of being down, being somebody who's booed, as you said, your children had questions for you, self-identity, all of those feeling potentially imposter syndrome, but you don't know, to a moment where you are standing in front of your partners and actually pitching an idea?
It's hard to say, but as I mentioned, when you're down, you can sell any product if you're up and driven and energetic. I'm one of those people that's able to do that. But if I am down and I'm using precisely the same words that I am using when I'm up and energetic, I won't sell anything. Because if you don't have the energy in your voice, if you don't feel the spirit in your body, if you don't really believe that this is going to happen, as I just mentioned, with the 100-meter sprint, then it's not going to work. So at a certain moment, I just was able to gain my self-confidence back, also because my two co-founders were extremely, extremely inspirational. And the trust, they could have fired me on the spot. They could have said, listen, you failed out. But they said, no, we failed ourselves. We have been on the edge of going bust ourselves. We were there when we all took the decision to do this. And you just have to fight and get back and believe in yourself. And, time heals all wounds. So as I mentioned, after a year, people had already moved to the next hype and they had forgotten about it. And I was very fortunate that I was responsible to build the international business development of Endemol outside the Netherlands, where the sports channel had much less coverage. So I could rebuild my reputation and rebuild my self-confidence outside the Netherlands. And once we started to succeed, because I joined Endemol when we were in 3 countries, and when we sold the company 7 years later, we were in 21 countries. So and then it was a big success story. Another thing I did, which was very helpful, was that after about the first year, I wasn't able to talk about this sports channel, Sports 7. And then I decided to do one big newspaper interview with one of the largest newspapers in the country. And they filled 2 full pages with it. And so after that, I said, okay, I've told it once. I'm never going to tell it again to a journalist. And that's it. And, since then, it's 24 years ago now. So I think I can easily talk about it nowadays. But it took a long, long time. I think the scars are indeed still there. But I'm happy with those scars now. Because at that moment, when you're in that situation, you can't see that it's valuable to be in that situation, that it actually, you may lose a lot of money, but it brings you a lot as a human being. And that's what it has done. So I'm pretty grateful actually for the experience.
That cathartic moment of talking to a journalist is a bit like having a public counseling session, right? It's like getting it out there and being prepared for the feedback, right? I was impressed that when I've learned about how you guys were running the Startup Bootcamp program, you actually had this concept of premediation built into the program. Yeah. So actually getting founders to talk about conflict, talk about more the emotional side of the challenges, even before the program started, right? So there seems to be also, you seem to be comfortable with the support mechanisms that are available for people to work through emotional problems. Was this something that came to you later in life, or did you have some external support when you were going through the sports channel challenges as well?
No, I never had any psychological counseling or anything when I went through the sports situation, which I think now, looking back at it, I probably could have used it tremendously, maybe even before that moment. If someone had firmly put my feet on the ground when I was so successful, that would have helped tremendously. I had a mentor in those days that came slightly afterwards, that also told me, I had been hired as the crown prince of the company. So we had 2 founders and I was the 3rd who came in. And this mentor said to me, a woman, by the way, she said, dude, you have to realize that crown princes very seldom become emperors. And she was right. And so it took me a long time to see the value let's say psychological support, of doing premediation and things like that. And if it would have been up to me, later I discovered meditation, mindfulness, and things like that. And I would strongly advise any founder, especially when you're in the middle of building the company, that those first couple of years are so intense. If you can save some time and meditate on a regular basis and just reflect, it's so powerful.
Are you still DJing those days?
Yes,
you are.
Yeah, I can. I'm going to pick up the computer and just point the camera. You see?
Yes, we see this.
So yes, my DJ deck is actually standing next to me. I have to put the microphone back because so now you can hear me again.
Yes.
Yes, I'm still DJing, but maybe those days. Usually I do about 6-7 gigs a year. But of course, because of Corona, the only gigs I'm playing nowadays are for my wife and my 2 cats.
What is the DJing? What's the role of it or value for you in balancing your life? And actually, I'm thinking, even were you DJing while you were going through this tough experience?
No, in those days I was so busy. I've been DJing until 1981, 82. And then I was so busy building these companies that I just couldn't find the time anymore. And I picked it up again in 2004, actually, when I met Annemiek, who was the love of my life. And when I told her that I'd been DJing for many years, she said, "Listen, why don't you buy equipment? I said, "Yeah, but I'm rusty and music has changed." She said, "Just buy the equipment, find someone who can bring you up to speed technically," which I did. And I went back DJing in 2004, and it was fantastic. And nowadays, if I have frustrations, I just bang the decks, and I was very proud that I played the terrace of Space Ibiza in the days that Space was still there. The Space closed down 3 years ago. Magic club, I think the best club I've ever been to. Elected the best club in the world 7 out of 10 times, and even if I'm not, although I was not in the major league of DJing, I made it all the way to Space, which was a magic experience. Yeah.
And so, apart from DJing, are there any other ways how you balance out in your life? And maybe you could connect it to what's currently happening in your life from the professional standpoint, and what experiences you're going through.
I became much more conscious about many things. I started realizing that, working 24/7 without a family life, that it ends pretty soon, that it's not in your own interest, but especially very impolite for your friends and family to neglect them, and to then, when you're in deep trouble, come back to them and say, "Hey, do you remember me? I was the guy who was so successful, and now I failed, and now I need you. But when I was successful, I was too busy to ask for your help or to be interested in you." I started taking care of my body in a much better way. I started eating healthier, much more than in the past. I'm totally vegan now. I hardly ever drink any alcohol anymore. I take my time to exercise. I take long walks, and I have a fantastic wife. She's a psychotherapist herself, which is fantastic because she forces me to talk about certain feelings and emotions. It's great.
Good to hear. I mean, I think a lot of that stuff can be inspiring to a lot of people, because one of the questions we get is when people share their story about the dip and the roller coaster, we don't manage always to go into what have I taken from that, right? And integrate it, because for a lot of founders, they still find themselves on the journey of actually picking themselves up from the experience, from the dip. So maybe didn't have enough time to actually reflect properly, grieve. Some of that experience which you described sounded like grieving actually, and then having the conversation with the newspaper.
I think there's so much we can dig deeper into, because you did talk about how your old relationship, your marriage ended, right? And that in itself is such a big thing that when you look at the professional failures, in your words, right, with a big sports channel debacle, and then on top of that, compounding this with losing what's supposed to be your safe place, right? You come across as being in such a better place now, and all since I've met you, which goes back to 2014. So there is something very inspiring about this, and also bearing in mind the kind of the curiosity we know that our listeners are having is really about finding the vocabulary to describe that something didn't go well, having the ability to point at the moments where you started searching for something, and it might be something that was imposed on you, something that you found through friends or mentors. But then also, as Vlad is saying, also finding the tools to actually help get better. I discovered counseling in my life in a period where I needed this from a personal relationship perspective, and I think that it should be mandatory for everybody. So hearing what you're saying is really inspiring, and it's really insightful. But there is also something around looking back and going, okay, I wish there was a time, or when I was having a difficult time, I wish there was something that I could have asked then to help me. And I wonder, is there something in your life looking back that you go, when I was having those difficult days in 1996, I wish I had X, Y, Z, a person, a mechanism, a tool?
No, I think, I was working so hard that I can't blame anybody for not counseling me. Because if they would have approached me and said, listen, you're really about to fall down, literally, because you're not going to survive this, I probably would have told them, listen, I don't want to hear it, because this is, once again, this is the marathon runner that shouldn't start wondering at 32 kilometers if he can do another 10K. You can only achieve certain huge things if you are able to push your way and to completely close out, let's say, any negative thoughts. But obviously those negative things are impacting you, and there will be a moment, anything that you suppress, there will be a moment that it will come out. And when it pops out bang, with a big bang. And, of course, I later thought, well, why didn't my wife warn me that I was about to fail? And I later concluded that it wouldn't have worked because I wasn't open to it. But nowadays, Annemieke, my present wife, she's pretty tough on me. She just grabs me by the arm and says, hey, she's a tough cookie.
Do you feel like you have words for describing what you went through emotionally?
It was just a huge roller coaster. Literally a huge roller coaster. And with all the fear that comes with it, with the rush that comes with it. Great sadness. I mean, you just mentioned mourning. When you work on a company and it's very intense, and with the failure of the company comes the fact that you have to let over 400 people go. That is really, I won't compare it to a close person around you passing away. Actually, I'm in Amsterdam because a 21-year-old nephew of mine passed away last week. But it is, to a certain extent, pretty similar. Yeah. So it's sadness, and you can't get it out of your mind, and you lie awake at night. And I always sleep extremely well. I very seldom lie awake from anything that happens business-wise in my life. But these two events were such that I just I didn't. When I divorced, I when I was going through a divorce, I've had a period of 10 weeks when I didn't sleep at all. I lost 16 kilos. I couldn't eat.
Wow.
I mean, I was a ghost. And, then at a certain moment, I was living on my own again. And I went into a pub I was riding my bike through a park in Amsterdam, and I noticed that I was whistling for the first time in months. And the sun was shining, and I thought, okay, it's time to stop grieving and mourning. It's time to move ahead. So I went into a pub, and I picked up a very nice lady and had a great night with her, and that was extreme. They call it the rebound fuck, I think. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, what was the magical moment for your mechanism, and we got it. I'm starting, and probably it's not eyes-opening, but I'm starting to see a pattern between the conversations. And the pattern is around this concept of, I lost my business. It doesn't matter. Today, I seem to confirm that, Ruud's business was a completely different scale to some of the stories that we've heard before. But the path around, I lost my business, and then there was this mourning, grieving period. That for me was very interesting to see the pattern there. And even more so, my question around how very quickly he jumped into an operational mode, right? Execution mode. And I don't remember, we talked about this before, whether it's an escape option or methodology mechanism. I don't know what word to put to it, but it's something I'm thinking of. Why people do.
I think it's a coping mechanism.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I think for me, it goes back, and I think we talked about this before, goes to me looking at the situation, trying to be as neutral as possible and look at the things I can control and things I can't control. And things you can control, you can turn into something you can do something about. You can become operational. Even if it's about winding down stuff, even if it's about unpleasant things, but you can keep yourself busy with something, which gives you a bit of a sense of purpose.
I guess so. But very often I also see around me, and even myself, that I jump to this executional operational mode, but then actually sometimes forget to actually really digest or absorb the experience from an emotional perspective. So I'm just thinking, obviously all of us do it in a different way, but I find that that's an element which is also very crucial.
Yeah, is it forgetting? Because it will come back. When you have to deal with it, it will come back. You cannot see, I don't think you can dedicate time and say, I'm going to spend 40% of my time processing what's happened and the other 60% working on it.
Interesting, because when I went through, not on that scale, but I had my own experience, right? And I had a coach at that time. Actually, he was a coach / a mentor. And one of the important things he told me after the experience, which was linked to professional, but also it was very heavily linked to my self-identity. And there was a loss. And one of the things he told me is that, hey, I'm already seeing you very quickly right after the experience to be focusing on new things to do, new goals, metrics, all of that, right? And one of the important things he told me was like, don't forget to actually very consciously create that space for you. So I wonder, Nectarius, because I feel that sometimes we don't go there because it's frightening to go there. It's frightening to create a space. So obviously there is no copy paste solution, and I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that sometimes it might be important for some of us to actually be aware of it, be conscious that it's an important thing to do, is to also understand what happened, and we from a different, by different means, different ways, and yeah.
I hear you. I understand what you're saying. See, it's interesting because I don't think we've often disagreed on our reflections.
True.
I worry sometimes that there's an expectation that there's a template to do this. So some people, and I've. So when somebody says to me, make sure you create that space for reflection because otherwise it goes straight into the next thing, I instantly become, what's the word? I kind of block
paralyzed?
off. No, not as
paralyzed.
strong as paralyzed, but I just get a bit stubborn and go, yeah, I'll create my own space when I'm ready for it. Who are you to tell me? So,
but that's you exactly. That's what I meant. Because you're also, quite self-aware. You're working on yourself. But I do remember that moment where I was like, yeah, I'll do it. I'll find the time. But hearing it from somebody else just to tell me that, hey, it was a mirror. That's all. It was a good mirror.
And it's also nice to use conversations like the one we had with Ruud, also just to reflect on your own behaviors, right?
Oh, very much.
When you said the thing about you start seeing patterns, the one thing that I see coming through every time, and it was with Brett and it was with Asma, is this built-in belief that it will get better and you just have to plow through it with support or without support, right? So even if you sometimes kind of try and scratch a little bit or dig a little bit deeper, sometimes this is really where it stops, is just fundamental belief that things will get better and I will come out of this, right? And it's something that, well, what was the example? The example with having to use the bathroom, right?
Yes.
And me thinking, there is an element of mind over matter. There's an element of, I can control this if I've got the mental space for it, right? And I'm always fascinated by people because I'm riddled with doubt and imposter syndrome in anything I do, including my personal relationship, including everything, right? But I learn to be comfortable with it, and that gives me the confidence. But other people tick so differently, right? And I always have a lot of admiration, but a lot of curiosity as well about this, for me, strange, intangible, fundamental belief that this is going to work out. I'm good at this. Right?
Yeah, I hear you. I'm wondering how much for Ruth also the personal played a role in that time, right? Because he was speaking about the importance or the impact of the divorce, and then also at the same time the new fresh air of the new relationship. And we saw it, and him, right? That you said it yourself that there is nearly a new layer to him today. So I wonder how much that play a role. I guess a big one. So maybe sometimes it's not the mind or the mindset on its own, although it plays a critical role. But then there are those other parts of puzzle or pieces of puzzle.
I need to put myself into different environments to get perspective. And it could be a physical move. It could be a different subject that I'm dealing with. I find it a lot more easy to get perspective than if I stay within my familiar environment.
For me to gain perspective is to see, what is happening around me, what people are going through, the different stories, all of that, the sharing, and just sometimes being an observer and realizing that, oh my Lord, what I'm going through, it's a very human experience, and I'm healthy and safe, have a shelter and all of that. I come back to the core or bottom, the foundation of the Maslow pyramid, really. And that helps.
You've been listening to Naked by The Future Farm, where entrepreneurship is stripped to its vulnerable core. To learn more about our work, sign up to our newsletter or visit thefuturefarm.co, where you can also apply to be a Naked guest. Naked is produced by Dan Turgel, coordinating producer Alena Zamirava, and edited by Catherine Dworkin.
And remember to subscribe, follow, and rate Naked to help us share it with the world.